Hello, this is Grandmaster Maxim Dlugy with Blitz Secrets. Bobby Fischer started to beat the dragon with the plan h4, h5, bishop h6, and mate. Today, we'll take a look at winning chess plans. Let's look at the practical aspects of defending bad positions. Let's take a look at the game Mamedyarov Aronian from the World Chess Blitz Championship 2012. And see how Aronian defends a bad position that he gets from the opening. So the initial moves d4, d5, c4, c6, knight f3, knight f6, and Aronian plays a very tricky and interesting system, queen c2, avoiding the main lines of the Slav or the Marian defense. Black takes on c4, queen takes c4, bishop f5, g3, all this is quite known, e6, bishop d2, bishop e7, castles, rook d1, knight bd7, e3. Actually, I was one of the first players who started playing it exactly in such a move order, to play e3 before getting the knight out to c3, and had quite good results with it as white, both in Blitz and in tournament chess. So let's see how black proceeds, and whether this novel move order poses problems for black. And in fact, you can see that this is the first thing that Aronian takes, and he plays a non-committal move h6, giving his bishop and king some air for the future. And after the move knight c3, the most obvious move is knight e4, but instead Aronian plays this very strange move, bishop c2, and the white puts the rook on an active square, rook e1, and then the bishop retreats to h7. This is a strange move order for black, and I doubt that this is the best way to play, but we'll see how white treats this. He actually retreats the queen to e2, with the idea of opening up and gaining control of the center with e4. So black obviously has to try to stop this, and he does so with knight e4. So stopping black's ideas, and white offers the exchange of knights, which black accepts. Taking on c3 was another option, by the way, and white recaptures back. And so we have this position where basically it's clear that white will try to play e4, after which we'll have a slight advantage due to the control of the center. Black plays knight f6, white continues to bring rooks to support his center, and Aronian tries to gain some space for the future. When white finds a very nice move, e4, the idea being that if queen takes pawn, bishop takes pawn, attacking the queen, and then this pawn cover in front of black's king is weakened, and hopefully later white can use this to create attacking chances. So obviously Aronian does not accept this dubious proposal and continues to add some more space to the queen side with the move a4. White stops this pawn before it gets too far. With a3, black would be controlling even more space, and black takes out his queen to b6, white plays bishop e3, and basically both sides have achieved what they wanted, except black plays queen a6 to reduce the number of pieces, and hopefully thinking that in the endgame he won't have any problems. White accepts the queen exchange, and after some thought presses through in the center. Basically this is a very strong move, because in positions where you have control of the center, you are the one guiding the way that the position will open up. So if you look at this position here, for example, if black simply captures all these pawns, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, knight takes, he has a choice of taking with the bishop, which is probably not the best way to play, although possible, because black can improve the position of his piece and play bishop f6, which creates maybe sufficient counterplay, although still white would be better. But I think rook takes pawn is even better. But the idea of moving this rook to b5, even on bishop f6, white play rook b5, and this pawn is under serious attack, and probably black will just have to struggle in a pawn down ending. So this is actually a serious problem for black, because he cannot play the most logical looking moves. So he has to find a way to be able to deal with this, as white simply wants to create some. First of all, white wants to play d6, which obviously will fortify this protected passed pawn and would be extremely dangerous for black. Secondly, even if this threat is somehow taken care of, white wants to play pawn takes pawn, creating another weakness, this pawn on c6. So here Aronian takes some time and plays this move rook d8. Of course, the idea is that since he's constrained for space, he wants to exchange pieces. And as often happens in chess and in Blitz especially, the most obvious way, the most simple moves are often the best. And here, the best way for white to proceed was to simply take this pawn. Rook cannot take because it's tied to the defense of the a pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Rook takes rook. Bishop takes rook. Rook attacks bishop. Probably bishop e7, and rook d4, attacking the a pawn. You can see that the passive position of this bishop does not allow black to really create any kind of a defense of the pawn, and it's not really possible to play bishop c5 because of rook d8 check, and the bishop has to go back, after which white can win material probably with bishop c5. So black would be in a very bad position here, trying to defend his pawns. And this is a very simple line that doesn't take, it seems, doesn't take much thought. But very often the most direct lines are the ones that are invisible to the human eye. And the way to mentally find these solutions is to basically ask yourself, what are my opponent's weaknesses? And that's the first question. And then how do I get to them? How do I attack those weaknesses? So the first question is simple. The weakness is the pawn on a4. Fixed where it is and blocked by white's pawn and attacked by the knight. And the second question, the answer to the second question is simple. After you exchange rooks, you get to this with the rook on d4. So once the rook gets to d4, it's not going to be possible to defend this a pawn. Had Mamedyarov actually seen this far, I'm sure that the game would have taken a completely different course, because it would be very, very difficult to defend. So in retrospect, maybe rook d8 is not such a good move, because it, although it creates complications, does not really solve the main problem, which is how to defend the a pawn. But here, instead of playing this direct approach, and you probably heard about Bobby Fischer's ability to play very good but simple looking moves. And this is exactly that. I'm sure that had Bobby been in this position, he would have done this move sequence attacking the a pawn in no time, because he saw for him chess was a very crisp game. He was able to sort of distill the thought process to a very simple methodology. So let's go back to the game and see what happened. Aronian played rook d8. He's now behind 1 minute on the clock. He has 1.5 minutes to white's 2 minutes and 15 seconds as he plays bishop f1, complicating the game further and attacking the rook. Of course, the rook has only really one move, because if b5, pawn takes pawn, this pawn hangs on b5. So not really clear why Aronian is thinking here, because really the only move besides rook 8, everything else loses. And now white plays bishop b6, black plays rook d7, and white plays bishop h3. It seems like there's no defense to the capture of the pawn on e6, and basically that means that black will lose material. But actually there is a defense, and the defense is the move rook a6, attacking the bishop. because now if the bishop moves, it will be possible to protect the e-pawn by simply taking the pawn with the pawn. White attacks black's rook, and again, leaving the rook off the d file would be dangerous because of the move d6. So black plays rook d7, and white pins the black's e-pawn, attacking the e6 pawn. This was the sequence that white calculated, thinking this was extremely strong, and it does in fact look extremely strong. So how to defend in such positions? When you see a position when you cannot defend the object of attack, look for things you can attack yourself, and perhaps this will be the solution. So in fact here, once you think about it that way, you'll see that black has the move rook a6 attacking the bishop. The tactical justification is simple. If white takes the pawn, black will first capture the rook, and whether white recaptures it immediately or after taking the pawn with check, black will then capture back the bishop, and white has no immediate win, and so black will be piece up. So that basically simply means that white has to retreat with the bishop, and for this white only has two squares, bishop d4 and bishop e3. Bishop d4 stops the line of attack that was created, and so black can simply capture this pawn, would stand fine. And so there only remains the move bishop e3, after which black has the excellent response knight takes pawn. This is in fact what happened in the game. Let's take a look at the time situation. The time situation is, of course, Aronian, second best player in the world, finds this sequence of events, plays rook a6, and after bishop e3, takes the e-pawn, but leaves himself only 50 seconds on the clock, even a little bit less, as white starts thinking about his next best move. Now, in this position, white has a choice. He can allow black to take this knight, ruining his pawn structure on the queen side, or actually take it himself. Now, if white took the knight, black would obviously recapture, and white would take the pawn on e6. Black would take back, and white could, for instance, take back with a rook, after which the strongest move for black here would be to simply play bishop d5, covering up the axis squares for the rook, after which probably white would be forced to take the pawn, and maybe he would have a move something like bishop c8, attacking the b pawn. White would play something like rook a5, bishop takes pawn, rook b5, after which white would not really stand any better here, because after black takes the pawn on b2, the a pawn would again be weak. So in retrospect, Mamedyarov, allowing the capture of the knight on c3 makes the right decision, because he would actually be worse had he allowed black to cover up the d file with the bishop. Let's see. Black, of course, takes the knight. Pawn takes knight, and now black has a number of possibilities. One of them is to simply take the pawn. The a pawn would be a very strong trump in the future, but he decides that he can always do that, so he just plays king f8 first, eyeing the a pawn. And of course, he understands that if white starts to play passively like bishop c1, he would have a very good position. But white plays very aggressively. Now black captures the e pawn, since moving the bishop was now impossible because of rook takes pawn check. White recaptures, and now black takes the pawn. Black is actually pawn up temporarily, but white can of course recapture the pawn by either immediately or after giving check on f7. Well, taking the pawn here would not be right, because black could defend against this bishop check either with the bishop to g8 or bishop to g6, and I think he would have a reasonably good position. And this a pawn, as I said earlier, is a criminal, and white would need to think how to keep it under lock and key. So instead, white checks on f7, king e8, and now takes the b pawn first. Black retreats back to d6. It's possible that bishop e7 was a stronger move, but of course there isn't much time. White takes the rook, the pawn on g7, and black simply plays the bishop c2, threatening to at some point to maybe cover up this diagonal of the bishop with bishop b3. And now this is a very critical situation. White actually got himself to a position where he only has 6 seconds left. So while we're looking at this, White is actually spending too much time. And one of the critical moments of the game was actually when he was thinking whether to allow Black to capture the knight on c3. Had he done that quickly and would have had half a minute left on the clock, I'm sure he would have found the resource that's going to appear shortly. Bishop h6 is the right move, incidentally. Black plays a3, and in this position, he really needed that time. Now, when you see so many pieces around Black's king, you have to think about mates. And here, this is a perfect example. White can create a mating situation. Since Black's main threat is to play a2, this is the position actually. Then White would first give this check, and after bishop f8, bishop takes pawn, rook takes bishop, play bishop h6. It turns out that no matter how Black tries, he can't really save this piece. He can't also deliver mate because after bishop e4 check, rook f8, king e7, f3, White effectively stops all of Black's threats, and basically would be 3 pawns up in this position, and I'm sure would probably would get this to a winning finale. So instead of finding this resource, which unfortunately with 6 seconds left is almost impossible to find, White plays bishop a2, to which Black responds rook b6 to try to get this queen, the a-pawn moving. Now White plays bishop g5, but trying to recreate this idea. So now if rook b2, again we could have the move bishop e6 with similar threats, or similar basic ideas we had looked at previously. So let's see. Now Aronian takes a few seconds to play the best move. He doesn't play rook b2, which is the most obvious move, but plays instead bishop b3. He understands that there's something going on here. Maybe he doesn't even see all the variations, but he understands that on rook b2, White would be forced to play bishop e6. And then he looks at this position and notices that rook g8 is very close to mate. And so instinctively, with 15 seconds left on the clock, he finds this move bishop b3. Your instincts should also be guiding you. If you see your king is in a dangerous position, try to not to go where your opponent is leading you. And so bishop b3 is an excellent move. Mamedyarov tries to confuse Black by playing bishop e3. Maybe the best way to play this position was to simply capture the bishop and then move the rook behind the passed pawn, and then move his h-pawn further. But instead of this, White decides to try some tricky stuff and plays bishop e3. The idea is simple. If Black goes rook b8, he can get White supposedly improves the position of his bishop, but it's not clear that the bishop is actually improved there. So, but Aronian instinctively finds the best move. He moves his pawn forward, which is exactly what will need to be done in very short order. Very shortly, you can see that this is going to be a big problem for White. Now the capture occurs, and after rook a7, rook takes pawn, White plays h4. Obviously, this is a race. Which pawns will queen first? White is trying to queen the pawn on the king side. Black is trying to queen the pawns that are not connected on the queen side. So it seems like it's a longer task for Black. But White's pawns are less further advanced. Plus, of course, with seconds left on the clock, both sides have under 10 seconds left. White has 7 seconds and Black has 10 seconds left on the clock. Black plays c4. In this position, it's natural, of course, to just continue to go with your plan and to play h5. But this move loses. It loses because Black actually has a threat created by White's inaccurate placement of his bishop on e3 earlier on. White's best move was probably to play king f1 to bring the king further to the defense of the queen side against this impending march of Black's pawns. And in fact, the position would remain very unclear, especially with such a limited time for both sides. Rook takes bishop would now not work because white's king is in the vicinity of this pawn. And who knows what would have happened in this case. So try to weigh the advantages and disadvantages of each sector of the board. So for instance, in this position, as black's pawns are menacing forward and the king is out of reach of this pawn, this move is a possibility and the pawn's just queen. But in this position, all of a sudden, it's a completely different situation, and black has to rethink how he will get these pawns going. Should he play rook c2 and a2? Should he play rook b3 and c3? Not at all clear, especially with such a short amount of time. Maybe he could play bishop takes g3, picking up some material to try to draw. I don't know. But in any case, king f1 was the right move. Instead, Mamedyarov plays h5 and gets hit with rook takes e3. And now he sees, as he was about to recapture the rook, he saw that he is losing after pawn takes rook, c3, h6, c2, h7, c1, queen with check. And of course, after that, black can simply stop the pawn from queening with bishop e5 and win the game. And since that's a clearly lost proposition, Mamedyarov looks and finds another chance. He simply plays the pawn to h6. Unfortunately, it's not enough for him in this position. And let's see how the game concludes. Aronian plays rook e6, h7, rook h6, rook a check, king d7, white queens the pawn, black takes, white takes back, c3, rook a1, c2, king f3, and black has to just be extremely careful and queen the right pawn. If he queens this pawn, white will actually be in time. So if he plays here, white can play here, and although the position is still lost, he still has to find this move. But when he plays bishop a3, it's clear that his next move will be queen, after which the exchange of the rook for the queen will produce another queen on the board, and so white resigned. So we just saw how black defended a very difficult position by looking for counter chances, looking for ways to attack white's pieces, and not letting him take control of the situation. In our next lesson, we will look at survival tactics in Blitz, how to sacrifice your queen in a dangerous position and win. This was Grandmaster Maxim Dlugy. Think better, play faster, watch Chess TV.